It was identified some time ago that the respiratory system is actually an upside down tree. If we think of the head being at the bottom, the trunk of the tree is known as the trachea, being Latin, trachea being Latin for trunk. It then branches out into two big branches, one going to the left lung, known as the left bronchus, and the right lung, the right bronchus. Bronchus being the Latin for branch. They then further divide down into ever diminishing tubes called bronchioles, small branches. Interspersed along these bronchioles and at the end are little gadgets called alveoli, which are similar to cat flaps, if you can think of the analogy of a cat flap, allowing the oxygen to pass straight into the blood supply. The arteries and veins would be very close to these vessels. If we now look at a picture of the respiratory system, we can see the various parts of the tree. So here is the trachea, the trunk. You can't quite see the bronchus at the back, but you can see these little bronchioles, the little white tubes, which would be full of air. And you can see in between these arteries in red and the veins in blue, very close on. If we go back up the trachea to the throat, you'll notice that there's two tubes at this stage. The tube at the back is the gullet, the food passage to the stomach, and this heavier tube is the start of the trachea. But how does food know not to go onto the lungs and to go into the esophagus? And it's this little gadget here called the epiglottis. You can think of the epiglottis as being like a leaf on a stalk, and when you swallow, when you make that gulp, that leaf flaps over the entrance to the trachea to prevent food going down onto the lungs, and the food will slide over the epiglottis and will be forced down the tube at the back to go to the stomach. So we can eat or we can breathe. We can't do both at the same time. It's one or the other. Sometimes this epiglottis doesn't work. For example, in stroke patients, this would just remain inert. So stroke patients would not be able to differentiate between the food or breathing, and food could well go onto the lungs. You'll see surrounding the lungs the pleural membrane. This is like cling film that wraps around each of the lungs. There's then a gap, which is the pleural space, and then another layer of cling film which would stick to the inside of the chest wall. And sometimes this space can get filled with air if there's an injury to the ribs and the ribs actually puncture one of these little bronchioles. Air can escape into this space and it would collapse the lung. Similarly, if an injury went into one of the blood vessels, blood would escape, fill this air space, and again it would collapse the lung. If air is collapsing the lung, that is known as a pneumothorax. If blood is collapsing the lung, that's a hemothorax. In both cases, it's emergency procedure to release this trapped air or this trapped blood. Doctors are often seen doing this as an emergency first aid, because a collapsed lung means there is no oxygen going into the bloodstream. So that the lung needs to be reinflated as a matter of urgency.